One of the people who was very important in my life from my family, my adoptive family, is my grandmother, Bibiane Lemrise, who was actually born Bibiane Hubert. She grew up in Quebec, actually in Quebec City, along with her sister, Therese, who would, interestingly, Therese would marry my great uncle Hubert, and Bibiane, my grandmother, would marry my grandfather, Aimé Lemrise. So two brothers actually married two sisters, and they lived together in the same place really their entire lives. Uncle Hubert and Aunt Therese, or Tunny, didn't have any kids of their own, so they were sort of like everybody's extra parents in my mother's generation or extra grandparents in my generation. And my grandmother, Bibiane, she was one of the people who in her generation lasted the longest. She died a number of years back, aged 93, after her sister and everybody else on that side and her husband had passed away, living in the home that they had since 1975, and surrounded by family. But I remember my grandmother from so many engagements, so many years. I've talked about in other videos how the family, in the 1930s moved to Chicago, lived in a particular block that was basically all French Canadian and Menominee Indian, all of them Francophone, in this spot around 50th and Halsted in Chicago, which was a poor neighborhood at the time, but they had their own community, they had their own church, Saint Jean Baptiste, and my grandfather's family kept on bringing down people from Quebec. So grandma was a Canadian citizen who became American. Grandpa was a third generation American, but of course everybody spoke French along with English after a while. And my mother grew up along with all of her cousins on that block. And they lived there into the 1970s, and then as people were, retiring and moving out of the city, my grandmother and grandfather and Uncle Hubert and Aunt Tunny and Uncle Ernie and Aunt Bernice, they all moved out to Indiana on some land that they'd bought. They built Wausau houses. Grandpa and Grandma's house was actually just right across from Aunt Tunny and Uncle Hubert. They put a 4-car garage in between them with a deck on top, and that's where we actually spent a lot of time, not just at Christmas and Easter and other kinds of holidays, but I would be there quite often, much of the summer. They would send me out there, and I would stay either at Grandpa and Grandma's house or Uncle Hubert and Aunt Tunny's house or in Uncle Ernie's house once he had died and it was sold off to my Aunt Bibiane and my Uncle Scott. So I spent a lot of time with Grandma, and she, they would come and visit us as well in our house in Wisconsin. And during the summer that my dad died, Grandpa and Grandma, because my mother had to be up in Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic with my dad, they stayed basically half of the summer with us. And then we went back to Indiana for the other half of the summer. So, I really got to know my grandmother quite well. She was always, she was a sweet person who always wanted people to get along, but she could bring the hammer down when she needed to. One of the common things that she would say to my grandpa, who was a pretty outgoing person who'd sometimes stir up stuff, she would say to him, Aimé, c'est pas ton affaire, meaning that's none of your business. Get the hell out of that and leave everybody to do their thing. And she was that way with us kids. Not as much as Aunt Tunny, her sister, who was probably more salty in that way. But if Grandma thought you were screwing up, she'd let you know. But she wouldn't be mean about it or anything like that. She'd talk to you and say, I don't think this is the right thing for you to be doing. And so I just remember all of these kind of, regular days spent with her. When I would be staying there, everybody had chores to do. And, get up in the morning, have some cereal, we'd chat. I would go do some things, whether chores or playing or some, reading or projects, and then come back for lunch. And she and Tunny would typically make lunch if we were in Indiana, and both of them were great cooks. So, we'd have some pretty good stuff, and it was usually fairly simple fare. Like I remember a great rutabaga soup that they would make pretty frequently, or, sometimes it would be, sandwiches or, maybe a roast with potatoes. They'd also make tootsie aye, which is this wonderful Canadian meat pie that I love to eat and I hardly ever get anymore because just about everybody who used to make it is gone. And there were all sorts of other similar things that they would do. And then, we would often in the afternoons, we would play cards. With my grandfather, I would typically play cribbage, sometimes with Grandpa and Uncle Aim or Uncle Art or some of the other people. With my grandmother, she was the one who taught me how to play pinochle. Now, that was a big, big game in my family. So pinochle was your entry as a young person to the big table where the adults sat and got real serious about gameplay. And we could play anything from two-handed, just her and me. She was teaching me how to play, to three-handed and four-handed. We went all the way up to eight-handed pinochle when my Uncle Scott would be playing and his parents would also show up. That's used 3 decks. It was something pretty amazing to do. Keeping all the cards right in your head was a lot of work. And so oftentimes in the afternoon, particularly when it was hot out, we would get out a card table, and sit, in the shade. And it would be like me and Grandma and Aunt Honey and Uncle Hubert, or maybe if Uncle Aim was around, he would join, or if Uncle Art was there, he would join as well. And, we'd always play. And the other game that I remember, I didn't learn from her, but she really enjoyed playing, was Rummy. And Rummy's a great game too to play. It's a wonderful card game, a lot of fun. And those things make you exercise your brain. You have to count cards, you have to put in bids in pinochle, thinking about what you could possibly get. You have to assess what your partner is doing. You also have to think strategically. So that was a lot of fun. I remember we did other things as well. Grandma would always be talking French to us, as did my mom, and did all the older people in the family. So I learned a good bit of my early French that wasn't swear words, which I learned from my uncles, like calice and immodzis, things like that. I learned a good bit more of my French from Grandma, in part because her English was never really that great. She always spoke with kind of an accent. Actually, not kind of an accent, a very thick accent. My mom had kind of an accent. And Grandma, she grew up in Quebec City, not even in Montreal where she'd learned some English. I think she learned English when she got here to the United States. Her and Tunny both. And, so there was a lot of speaking French and, going to bed, à demain, we'd sing songs in French and all of that as well. And, we spent a lot of time together when I was a kid, when I was an adolescent, a teenager, getting in trouble. She did a lot of praying for me, which I'm always grateful for. And then, I kind of got my act together by the time I was in my 20s. And, well, kind of. Took me a while. And, she was always patient with me. I could tell when she wasn't happy about what I was doing, but she always, she was always there. And she always had useful things to say. And I could talk to her about all sorts of stuff. I remember when I was living in Carbondale and I had come back to the church and I was trying to develop something like a prayer life. And I remember writing her and asking her, I think you're the best person for me to ask about this. How should I pray? And she wrote me back, and it was just a fairly simple advice. She was like, just bring your problems to God and talk to him about them, and maybe you'll get something that you think is a reply. Maybe you won't, but just keep at it, and don't forget to say your, at the end of it, your 3 Hail Marys, because she's looking out for you as well. And it was just down home, a person of quiet faith advice. But I could also ask her, like, how do you make this dish? Or what do you think about what's going on with this person in the family? And it would all be kind of the same. It was all on the same level, filled with love and care and sometimes frustration. And, there wasn't like any big thing of, well, here's the supernatural and the holy over here, and then here's the rest of our life. It all just kind of permeated each other. And from her, I would say, not just from her, but, from her in particular, I learned that kind of, let's call it attitude about holy things, that they don't have to be scary, that they don't have to be awe-inspiring. They can just be quiet and part of the life that we live together. She was also a very peacemaking person. I remember, after my dad had died, I was pretty messed up for quite a while. And they were staying, my mom went somewhere, maybe with her boyfriend on a vacation, and it was Thanksgiving. And Grandpa and Grandma Lemrise were staying with us, and Grandpa Sadler, my dad's dad, who was a hardcore alcoholic and all sorts of trouble, was living with us still at the time. And I got into a big argument with my Grandpa Sadler about something. I was a teenager. I don't know what it was about, but we got into a huge shouting match. And then Grandpa Lemrise was like, well, we're all going out for Thanksgiving dinner, but you're staying here, buddy, because you got to be respectful to your grandfather. And Grandma was the one who interceded. She was the one who was like, you can't leave him here. I understand that he's acting like a jackass. I'll make sure that he apologizes, but you cannot leave him here. And I was like, at the point of tears, but I, of course, wasn't going to show it because I was a, tough guy and all that. And she just had a way of, like, taking conflicts and undoing the threads of them. She didn't threaten. She didn't usually even raise her voice, but she came in and she could fix things with people. I really admired that. I am not that sort of person, and we need those sort of people in life. And God knows how many people she did that for in our crazy, wild family of people who, get in arguments and shout at each other, and sometimes blow up at each other all the time. She was this quiet presence. So, these are some things about her that I really remember. I was fortunate in that not only did I get to spend a lot of time with her and the other family members in my childhood and in my teenage years and even in my 20s, but when my mother died, and I took part of the inheritance and bought Uncle Hubert and Aunt Therese's old house, because by then Uncle Hubert had died and Aunt Tunny had Alzheimer's and was living across the way with Aunt Bibiane. And we moved into it. That meant I got to see Grandma every single day. And along with, Aunt Bib and Uncle Scott and Uncle Aimé and people like that, once Aimé moved back there. And I got to see Grandpa too when he was still doing well before he succumbed to Alzheimer's and wound up in a home about 45 minutes away. And so I'd get to see her every day, and I'd talk to her about what we were growing in the garden. They'd long since quit having a garden, but I started resuscitating the gardens and growing tomatoes and peppers and cleaning out the weeds and the invasive autumn olive, and bringing the lilacs back and planting things that I found in the woods that Uncle Hubert had planted, all those sorts of things. We'd chat about that. We'd play cards together. She would often tell me stories about, what people were like. She was a resource. I could go to her and ask her about things. And I would often take her to Mass. It's interesting. So, with going to church, generally, most people go on Sundays, but in Catholic churches, after Vatican II, they started having these. You could go on Saturday for the vigil, and it's a Mass. It's a regular Mass. And for some reason, Grandpa and Grandma started really liking that afterwards, and they preferred to go on Saturdays. So after Grandpa could no longer drive, because he was succumbing to Alzheimer's, I would take them out there, and then eventually it was just me and Grandma, and sometimes I would take Kat, the oldest of my kids, actually the only for a while, and we'd all three of us go together. And Kat really liked Grandma too, and there was a lot to like. So we would go to Mass, and she'd have to go up these stairs. After a while, they put in like a automatic lift. I mean, by that time, she was in her 80s and still mobile, moving around, taking care of herself for the most part, helping to cook. We would eat a lot of meals either down in our basement or over at Aunt Bib's, and Grandma would get in there, and she would never try to take over, but she would always be like, "What can I do? How can I help?" And she just loved seeing all of the grandkids and great grandkids. She took delight in that, So there were really wonderful moments that we had in our life because of this constant benign presence of Bibiane Hubert, then Lemrise. And I will mention her death. So, she was slowing down more and more. She was also kind of feeling a sort of loneliness. I remember sometimes she would say at the table, "Why doesn't God just take me? Look how old I am. Everybody that I love is gone." And we'd say, "Well, don't you love us?" And she'd say, yes, of course. I love all of you. But I mean, everybody that I grew up with, everybody in my generation, they're all gone, And she was right. She was one of the last people in that tier of the family. And, she started slowly kind of winding down, being able to do less and less. She kept her mind active all the way to the end. Every day she would do her word search and some other puzzles. She knitted until she couldn't anymore, because of her hands. And she loved to engage in conversation about things. So she kept her marbles. She was lucid all the way to the end. And, what ended up happening is she died effectively of congestive heart failure. 90-year-old bodies, anything can go wrong. So, that night we could tell that she'd been doing poorly for a while. We could tell that she was, maybe on her way out. So I called the parish priest. The church was about 15 minutes drive, and his name was Father Stephen Snowich. He's long since passed away. He was in his late 70s, early 80s at the time. So he was actually a monk from St. Meinrad Abbey down in southern Indiana, but he was on loan to our church. Great guy. And so anyway, I called him up and I said, hey, I think you need to come out and give last rites to my grandma. And he was like, well, do you think you could come pick me up? And I was like, I'm on my way already. So I get in the car, I go pick him up, drive him out there. And it was kind of dark. And it was, it's interesting because now that I think about this, there were 4 generations there. It was Grandma, who was getting, extreme unction, last rites. It was Aunt Bibiane, her daughter, her namesake. It was me, her grandson from my mom, Monique. And then it was my oldest kid, actually at that time I think only kid, Kat, who, would be her great-grandchild. And we're all there. We all, are witnessing the anointing and the Eucharist, and we all got to say goodbye to Grandma. And I do regret one thing about her night that she died, and she passed away probably about 3 a.m. Kat and I, around maybe after we drove Father Stephen back, we hung out with Grandma till about 11 o'clock, and then it was, very late for Kat, so, took her back home, and we went to bed, thinking that we'd see Grandma again in the morning. And unfortunately, we didn't, because it was the end. And I remember thinking to myself, say thank you to her. Thank you for all the things that she gave you, all of the presence that she was in your life, all of the helpful advice, all the prayers that she said for you all those years. And I thought to myself, I don't want to burden her. She's got her own things to think about. I will say it to her in the morning when I see her in the morning. And of course, like a dummy, there wasn't any morning, right? By the time that we woke up, she was gone. And I like to hope that she, knew how grateful I was to have such a great person as such a constant presence in my life. But, this is kind of a case in point. Say the things you need to say when you need to say them. So on that note, I'm going to end this story about Bibiane Lemrise, my wonderful grandmother, who I was so fortunate to have as somebody in my life for, probably 38 years of my life. So, yeah, I hope that you have people like that in your life. It really makes a big difference when you're kind of a mess. So, and I still think about her, I won't say daily, but at least weekly. And, I tell stories about her to my own kids, to my wife, to people in the family. And now I'm doing that with you.